Hey everybody, today we're talking about biodiversity. We did a little introduction with our concept map last week. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what biodiversity is and start getting into those main ideas of how we measure it and how we identify it. So it's important to know that there's three different types of biodiversity. There's the ecosystem diversity, which is the number of different habitats that are available on Earth in a given area. So it's not just, the tundra biome, but it's the different habitats within that tundra biome or the different habitats within ecosystems. Okay, the next type of diversity is species diversity. This is the number of different species within an ecosystem, and we look at the balance or the evenness of the population sizes of all the species. So it's not just the number of different species, it's also the number of each type of species within that ecosystem. That tells us a little bit about the health of the ecosystem and whether or not it's going to be able to rebound from any sort of changes or disturbances. And then the last one's genetic diversity, which is how different the genes are of individuals within a population. That's really important because genetic diversity is going to decrease organisms dying off because of disease. Genetic diversity is very important to allow variation within the species and allow evolution to continue and evolve. In general, you should know that higher biodiversity usually means better ecosystem and population health. So higher biodiversity usually means that the ecosystem is healthier. So a couple of ways that we measure this, we talked about on our, I don't know why my thing's spazzing out here. We talked about this on our concept map, is species richness and species evenness. So richness is just the total number of different species found in an ecosystem. So there's 50 different species within a forest in Pennsylvania. Okay, it's not, generally we're looking at plants and animals. It's not just animals, it's not just plants. Generally, high species richness is a good sign of ecosystem health. More species usually means you have higher quality water resources, higher quality soil, a variety of prey species. So species richness is an important measure, but species evenness is also a very important measure because evenness is a measure of how balanced are those species within the ecosystem. So what's the population size of each of those species? If you have a dominant species or if you have a well-balanced population, one dominant species could mean that the ecosystem is a little bit more fragile because if you lose that one species, you have a higher likelihood of losing, the health of the entire ecosystem. So if you take a look at this diagram here, they both have the same richness, the same number of different species, but this one is much more evenly balanced, whereas this one is predominantly this one tree species. So if a fire or a fungus, there are fungi that affect plants. If a fungus comes out and wipes out all of these trees, then you're left with very few other trees. Whereas in this ecosystem, if you lose these 4 trees, you have a little bit more balance, a little bit more health left in your ecosystem. Genetic diversity is also very important because it's a measure of how the different genomes or those genes within the population are diversified. So that means that if some sort of mutation or disease comes through, the population may be better suited to survive that disease or mutation. Genetic diversity is common in all populations because you probably remember in biology, there's random mutations all the time when DNA gets copied and when chromosomes get copied and moved around, and then how those are passed down to their parents from parents to offspring varies from generation to generation. So that is a natural way that genetic diversity happens. If you have higher genetic diversity, the better the population, like I said, can respond to environmental stressors like things like drought or disease or famine. Because of that genetic diversity, you have an increased likelihood of organisms being able to survive and then reproduce and pass their traits down, which is eventually going to lead to evolution. So here's your example of this. If you've got a diverse crop, and then afterwards you lose some species, you're more likely to lose the entire population. So here, the original crop is very diverse. Then you have a potato blight. You lose one population of potatoes, but you still have a good crop left here if you only have one type. This is what happens sometimes with our crops, like farming crops. We see this in things like corn before we used genetically modified corn. One thing that can impact a population is any sort of environmental disturbance, like a natural disaster or habitat destruction that drastically reduces the population size. That kills organisms regardless of their genome. This is called the bottleneck effect. When this happens, your surviving population is smaller, and because the individuals died randomly, it doesn't necessarily represent the genetic diversity of that original population because you lost organisms for no particular reason. When that happens, you reduce your genetic diversity, and so your surviving population may have predominantly one type of gene, or as they reproduce, you might lose more organisms because of that predominant gene. That means it's more vulnerable to any sort of future environmental disturbances. So that bottleneck creates a likelihood of loss of population in the future. Right, so here in this population of mice, you have a good mix of black, brown, and white. But for some reason, this large population died off. Maybe it was a poison that was put out, and only 3 species survive. So that when they reproduce, you have no white population. So look in the winter, if they're being hunted by owls, they're going to be easily seen by any predator because they're going to stand out in the snow. You also see something called inbreeding depression, and that's when the bottleneck effect occurs and organisms mate closely with related quote-unquote family members, cousins, and things like that. That leads to a higher chance of offspring having harmful genetic mutations because they're getting similar genotypes from both of their parents. This is one of the reasons that zoos have a very stringent policy of vetting mates for lions when they're mating them in captivity. They really look through, they create this whole big family tree to ensure that those populations aren't inbred at all, because it increases the likelihood of having these genetic mutations. So there's actually a breeding program where they trace each of the cats or each of the organisms, their genealogy back to make sure that those populations don't get too closely related, so that they can maintain genetic diversity within the captive organisms. Generally, smaller populations are more likely to experience inbreeding because they might have a hard time finding a non-related mate, meaning like a cousin. And that makes it very difficult for the population to increase or maintain that genetic diversity. For example, the Florida panther population decreased down to 30 total Florida panthers in the 1900s because of habitat loss and hunting. They started seeing birth defects and genetic defects, and in order for them to rebound, they actually started mating them with a population in another area. Pumas, actually, from Texas. Okay, so when we see these different types of genetic diversity, it leads us to the idea that ecosystems and organisms have to be able to be resilient. And the term resilience means that organisms or ecosystems can return to their original conditions after a major disturbance. So if an ecosystem has high genetic diversity of plants, of animals, if ecosystems have a wide variety of habitats in one region, they are more likely to come back from one of these disturbances. Higher species diversity gives you higher ecosystem resilience, especially when it comes to plants, because plants are going to be the basis of your food chain and your food web. So in your ecosystem, you need to make sure that you have a wide variety. If you don't have a wide variety, you're less likely to see that habitat rebound. All right, so for your practice FRQ, describe one of the 3 levels of biodiversity and explain how high biodiversity at the level you described benefits ecosystems. All right, guys, here's your wisdom today. Remember, you can sit on a mountain, but you can't sit on a pin because it's always the small stuff in life that hurts. Have a great day.